Okay, so I think we're just going to get started. So thank you everybody for taking time out of your evening for coming to this training. We're going to be talking about human trafficking. So this is our one-on-one training and it's for our community. So I'll do a quick introduction. My name's Sarah. I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator with the Human Trafficking Support at the Asian Association of Utah. And I see a lot of familiar faces, so most of you guys already know who I am. So what we're going to be doing, going over some objectives. So we want to be able to define human trafficking and recognize potential indicators of trafficking. We want to be able to summarize risk factors for victimization and describe the dynamics of power and control, and then identify ways to help fight against human trafficking. So why are we learning about human trafficking? So human trafficking is one of the fastest growing illicit industries in the US, and oftentimes victims don't seek out help. It is happening here in Utah. Only about 1% of trafficking victims are identified, and only about 5% of victims will receive treatment. And without treatment, 80% of them are at risk of being re-victimized. And so when I talk about treatment, this can look like getting access to social support services, such as our agency. So we're going to go through a few myths or facts, and people can either unmute themselves or pop in the chat your answers. So the first one, all human trafficking involves sex. Do we think that's a myth or a fact?
Myth.
What else? Who else? Myth or fact?
Myth.
Okay. So it is a myth. Worldwide, experts actually believe that there are more situations of labor trafficking that occur than sex trafficking. But there is a much wider awareness around sex trafficking in the US as opposed to labor trafficking. But oftentimes people do tend to associate sex trafficking and oftentimes don't really recognize labor trafficking. So the next one, so only women and girls can be victims and survivors of sex trafficking. Do we think that is a myth or a fact?
Myth.
Myth.
All right,
Myth.
anybody else? So it's a myth. So we do serve both women and men, and women and girls are not the only ones that can be victims or survivors of sex trafficking. We actually do serve a lot of males that are victims of sex trafficking as well. So the next one, so labor trafficking is only or primarily a problem in developing countries.
Myth.
Izzy says myth. Anyone else? So that is a myth. So labor trafficking does occur in the US and in other developed countries, but is reported at lower rates than sex trafficking. The next one. So traffickers target victims they don't know. Do we think that this is a myth or a fact?
Myth. Myth.
Yep, Monica says a myth. Yeah, so many of our survivors that have been trafficked by romantic partners. That could include spouse or family members or parents. So oftentimes victims of human trafficking often know their trafficker. Okay, the last one. So people in active trafficking situations always want help getting out. Do we think that this is a myth or a fact?
Myth.
Myth.
Okay. Yeah, so that is a myth. So every trafficking situation is unique, and self-identification as a trafficking victim or survivor happens along a continuum. So things like fear, isolation, guilt, shame, and misplaced loyalty, expert manipulation are among the many factors that may keep a person from seeking help or even identifying as a victim, even if they are in fact being trafficked. So thank you guys for your participation with that. So now again, I'm going to ask for some more participation. How would you define human trafficking? So in your own words, what is human trafficking?
Would it involve like I don't even know. I honestly don't know. It's against their will.
Okay. Anyone else want to share?
Well, before I started this job, I thought human trafficking was really um, just basically slavery.
Mm,
But I didn't have a better definition in my mind besides that, and assuming that people were completely against their will and being held somewhere.
yeah. I saw that
And
Artemis
Artemis is
has
raising her
her
hand.
hand up.
So I don't really know, but if I were to venture a guess, I would say probably um, someone being severed from community or location ties and forced or coerced into doing um, labor or otherwise giving of their bodies in ways that they don't necessarily want to or wouldn't want to if all else were equal.
Yeah.
That's all I've got.
Awesome. Monica also said in the chat, taking advantage of someone. So these are really, really great, starting points, but the actual formal definition that Webster Dictionary gives is human trafficking is an organized criminal activity in which human beings are treated as possessions to be controlled and exploited as by being forced into engaging in commercial sex or involuntary labor. So there's always going to be some sort of exchange of good or of some sort of good in exchange for some sort of service. So I like to pair this definition with this AMP model. And so this really does give us a better breakdown of what we can kind of look for when we're having conversations with potential survivors or just really enhancing our knowledge on human trafficking. So this AMP model looks at what actions were taken by the trafficker, by what means, and for what purpose. And so when I talk about what actions are taken by the trafficker, this can look like recruitment, harboring, transporting, providing, or specifically as it relates to sex trafficking, patronizing, soliciting, or advertising. One thing that I do want to talk about before we get into the rest of this is when we're talking about what actions are taken by the trafficker and taking into consideration some of our exposure or knowledge on human trafficking, whether that's being from articles that we may read or movies that we may have seen, that there is this misconception that there's always transportation that's involved when we're talking about human trafficking. So if anybody's seen The Sound of Freedom, or if anybody's seen the movie Taken, there is this idea that a victim is always going to be transported, whether that be to other countries, different cities, whatever it may be. But this is actually widely misunderstood. Trafficking and transportation does not always need to be involved. So if there is transportation, that can happen, but it's not always the case. So transportation and trafficking do not always go hand in hand. That can be an aspect of trafficking, but it's not needed in order for trafficking to occur. Talking a little bit more about recruitment, I'm going to touch on this later on as we go out through the presentation. But when we're talking about by what means, so what means did this trafficker use to keep this person or to get this person engaged in some sort of commercial sex act or labor or service? So this looks like force, fraud, or coercion, which I will provide some more examples when we go into the next slide. And then for the purpose, it's obviously going to be for some sort of commercial sex act or labor or service. One more thing that I do want to touch on for this slide is that force, fraud, or coercion are not needed in order for minors under the age of 18 to be induced into commercial sex acts. So anybody that's under the age of 18 that has been induced into commercial sex acts, we really do not need to see that aspect of force, fraud, or coercion in order for it to be a case of human trafficking, because a person under the age of 18 cannot legally consent to sex. Do we have any questions about any of that I just talked about? Cool. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat. Going into a little bit more further detail. So what do I talk about, or what do I mean when I say force, fraud, or coercion? So forcing someone can look like physical harm or restraint. This can look like sexual assault, confinement, or isolation. When I talk about fraud, this can look like false promises of employment, a false idea of what their working conditions will look like, a false idea of what a better life looks like, wages, or a relationship. So really employing this sort of false promise as to what's going to be expected. And then when I talk about coercion, this looks like psychological abuse, manipulation, physical and psychological isolation, blackmail, threats against the victim or another person, or threats to report the victim to immigration authorities or law enforcement. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit more as we continue through the presentation. Okay, So, taking a little bit of a break, I want to talk about our program and our agency as a whole. So, our agency or our program, Human Trafficking Support, started in 2010. So, we've been providing services for 14 years now. One of our main focuses is really our wraparound services. So, we can serve any survivor of human trafficking, no matter where their trafficking occurred. And we serve the whole entire state of Utah. So anybody that lives in the state of Utah and identifies themselves as a survivor of human trafficking, they are eligible to receive our services. So a few wraparound services that I do want to highlight, I have a whole list on the right-hand side, but ones that I do want to highlight is housing assistance, mental health support, and legal advocacy. So one of the biggest needs that we're seeing when working with clients is housing assistance. So when we're talking about an individual's trafficking situation, most oftentimes what we're seeing is that their trafficking situation is tied to their housing. So getting them access to housing assistance throughout a variety and a spectrum of needs is something that we see and is a continuous need with almost every single client that we work with. Another need that we do see a lot of is mental health support. So AAU is great in that we have a behavioral health team that is located downstairs. And so if clients are eligible to receive our mental health support downstairs, they have a nice catch-all where they can come to our agency, get case management for their trafficking situation, and also get mental health support. And then lastly, legal advocacy. So when we're talking about legal advocacy, we do not provide legal services in-house, but we can get clients connected to legal advocacy and legal supports within the community. And so having really great connections with Utah Legal Services, Catholic Community Services, Immigrant Legal Services, and then we also partner with a few other private attorneys to be able to help clients apply for what we call a trafficking visa or a T visa. And so if a person's trafficking situation happened here in the state of Utah and there is some sort of police report or documentation, they are eligible to apply for this trafficking visa that would give them refugee-like benefits here in the States. And so a lot of times when we do have individuals that are leaving their trafficking situation, maybe they came here on some sort of work visa and they are to leave that trafficking situation, they would then left be undocumented here in the States. And so there is that huge need of being able to get them connected to legal advocacy if that's applicable for their situation. Kind of going into a little bit more of what our other program areas are. So we also provide outreach and education, which is where my role specifically steps in. So providing education to the community and to a lot of our community partners is really, really important because we recognize that human trafficking has a lot of intersections with a lot of other social services. So making sure that we're doing trainings to community partners to talk about what human trafficking looks like here in Utah, how to best support survivors, and how to get them connected to our services is really, really important. Talking a little bit more about our outreach. So our biggest outreach effort, we conduct weekly outreach at our drop-in center. So it's a separate location from our admin office. And there we can provide crisis case management. We partner with a lot of community partners such as 4th Street Clinic to provide medical care in-house. We also partner with Soap to Hope where they do a lot of harm reduction and syringe exchange. We partner with Be a Little Too Kind that will hand out warm meals to the community. And then we also work with Utah Naloxone so that our staff is trained and equipped to be able to train those in the community how to use naloxone and what naloxone is used for. So naloxone helps in any case of overdose. So being able to get our clients that may need that support connected to that and be able to hand that out is really, really important. We also provide clothing, food, hygiene, safe sex kits, and we'll often provide housing consultations. So meeting with folks and asking them, what's going on with your housing right now? What's going to best work for you? And oftentimes what we see when we are working at our drop-in center is a lot of our clients don't have documentation. And so being able to get them waivers to be able to apply for their birth certificates or their social security card or their ID to really get them in those preparatory steps of being ready to get housing. And then we also talk to folks almost every day when we're doing outreach at our drop-in center about what our program does. So maybe we'll have somebody come in that, they heard from word of mouth what AAU does and that we help provide case management. And so oftentimes we're having conversations with folks, telling them what we do, what services we provide, and really talking to them about what their current situation is and how we can best support them or make referrals to other agencies that can provide that. Lastly, one thing that I want to talk about is our partnership with the Utah Attorney General's Office. So we help them co-host our Utah Trafficking in Persons Task Force, which has a group of about 40 community partners where we just talk about what human trafficking looks like here in Utah and how we can best support our clients. We also have an upcoming event this month, so January 25th. The AGO's office and then AAU are helping co-host our UTIP annual conference, which is a free webinar, so people can join virtually or in person, where we've got a whole spectrum of community partners where they're talking about human trafficking and how that may intersect with other sort of social service needs. Any questions about human trafficking support in our program?
What would make somebody eligible for the mental health support? Do you just kind of do a screening just to see what level they need to go to or who they would need to see?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So our behavioral health team, they only accept those that are under Medicare or Medicaid and are uninsured, but those thresholds tend to change depending on the needs. So depending on behavioral health funding, I believe will determine, who we can take for behavioral health and who we would have to refer out. So that's kind of what I mean by threshold. So even if somebody wasn't necessarily eligible for mental health support in our agency, then we would help them be able to get access to other mental health supports throughout the community to be able to provide that as well.
Amy, too, just to chime in to so you're right, but once they're referred over, we would do an intake. And in that intake, which takes about 3 hours, that's really when the assessment's being done of the mental health assessment. And from there, the next best step is decided. So whether that means ongoing therapy or referral out, like Sarah said, or consistency, then that's decided by a licensed mental health therapist after the intake.
Thanks, Scott.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right, so talking into more about our data. So this is actually from 2023. Look at us, we're getting data super early in the year. So looking at the numbers of who we served in 2023. So in 2023, we served a total number of 942 trafficking survivors across all human trafficking programming, which is actually a 62% increase in clients that we served compared to the last year, so 2022. We had only served 580. And so when I'm talking about human trafficking programming, this looks like any sort of involvement that we may have had with clients during that year. So what I didn't really touch too much on was our interim list. And so we have a lot of clients that are currently waiting to get access to a full case manager. So we're interacting with them almost weekly or consistently. This is taking into consideration our drop-in numbers and also just our clients that we serve that have an assigned case manager. Looking at those numbers a little bit more closely for case management is we served a total number of 142 primary survivors with 103 additional secondary survivors. And so when I talk about secondary survivors, this looks like spouses, or this looks like any children of the primary survivor. So even though we are mainly serving the primary survivor, there are some times where we'll have needs come up with the secondary survivors as well, and being able to help them get access to certain services. Looking at the breakdown for primary survivors. So of our primary survivors, 17% of those were youth, 62% of them were female, and 61% of those were foreign nationals. Taking a broader look at that, so taking into consideration the trafficking type. So we served 46% of our survivors identified as sex trafficking survivors, 46% identified as labor trafficking, and then aspects where there was both sex and labor trafficking present, 8% of our primary survivors had met that criteria. What you'll also see for labor trafficking of the clients that we served, that 98.5% of our survivors identified as foreign nationals. So we worked with a lot of foreign nationals, and that's where we were kind of seeing a big increase of labor trafficking survivors having identified as foreign nationals. Any questions about the numbers so far, or any questions at all? Well, so taking a more geographical look at human trafficking cases as it relates to the state of Utah. So I'm going to ask everybody to kind of share their observations when we're looking at this map. So what you see on here are hotspots that indicate human trafficking. And so where are we seeing trends as it relates for human trafficking and where it's located geographically in the state?
Looks like it's more center city or just right in the bigger city, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the more urban areas Looks
Mhm.
like they have more cases.
By freeways. Any other observations that we're seeing?
With the exception of that red spot down, what is that? Down south?
Yeah,
It's is there an interstate at that red spot? Because I was gonna say interstate specifically, not just regular highways, but
for sure. Yeah,
and then I also see, I mean, I could be wrong because I don't know about Southern Utah demographics, but
Mhm.
it seems like there's a correlation between like the the where the church is strongest out there and the red spots. Again, I could be wrong. I don't know my Southern Utah demographics that well, but
interesting. Yeah, I haven't had anybody share that sort of observation. That's really interesting. But some of the trends that we're seeing on this map. So the more red the hotspot area is, the higher concentration of human trafficking. So we're seeing it a lot of populous areas. So if we're looking at Salt Lake City area, so the more urban an area is, the higher increase in criminal activity, and human trafficking often follows suit for that. But also taking a look at some of the rural areas. So if we're looking in Price, Cedar City, St. George, we are seeing some hotspots as it relates to those areas. Somebody mentioned by the freeways and the highways. So Utah is considered the crossway of the West. And so if there is transportation that is involved, again, that's not always the case. There are easy trade routes that are available. If there is any sort of instances where transportation is involved, we have had a few cases where that has happened, but it doesn't always happen. But that is a trend that we're seeing, is that there is a lot of trafficking that occurs along the highways and the interstates. So thank you guys for sharing that. Moving on, so talking about where does trafficking happen as it relates to industry specific places. So the ones that have the stars on them are the ones that are most common here in Utah. But if anybody has any interest in looking at this in a little bit more further detail, Polaris actually did release a typology report back in 2017 of the 25 types of modern slavery. And that gives a breakdown of the demographic of victims within each typology, as well as the trafficker profile, recruitment tactics that were used, and the methods of control. It's actually a really interesting article, and it's interesting to see how certain aspects change as it relates to the industry that's impacted. So if anybody has any interest in that, I'll definitely make sure to pass that along or have Scott send out another email with that resource available. But as it relates to sex trafficking, so where are we seeing which industries are most impacted as it relates to sex trafficking here in the state of Utah? So ones that we're seeing is pornography, massage parlors, streets, and residence-based commercial sex. So when we're talking about residence-based commercial sex, this looks like where the trafficking exploitation either occurred in the home, where maybe that trafficker was providing that victim with a place to stay, or they're having to go to different residential areas to engage in sex work. When we talk about streets, this will kind of tie in a little bit more later in the presentation when I get into risk factors and vulnerabilities, but just to kind of keep that in mind. And then also looking at labor trafficking. So where we're seeing industries that are most impacted by labor trafficking here in the state of Utah, agricultural, restaurants, and hotels and motels. So Utah, again, is considered a very rural state. And so there is a lot of opportunities for labor trafficking to occur in those agricultural industries. So if we're talking about sheep herding, this can also look like egg farms or marijuana farms. That's kind of where we tend to see most of that labor trafficking occur as it relates to the agricultural industry, but also talking about restaurants. So we do see a lot of labor trafficking occur in restaurants, kind of in those more populous areas, so located more in Salt Lake. And then talking specifically about hotels and motels, we see this occur more in Park City. So a lot of times individuals will be coming to Park City since it is a seasonal work opportunity. So they might come on some sort of visa. What we see most are H-2A, H-2B, and J-1 visas, where somebody will come to the US on some sort of visa and their trafficking will occur in that hotel or motel space. And so we tend to see that a little bit more in the Park City area. Any questions so far? So, talking about victims of human trafficking, again, I'm going to encourage, if anybody feels comfortable, to unmute themselves or write in the chat. What do you think of when you think of a victim of human trafficking? Feel free to share. A safe space here. Minor, women, and children. Anybody else want to share? What do you think of when you think of a victim of human trafficking?
I think old. I think of someone like my grandpa, if he had been any less lucky, might have gotten swept up in something like this.
Yeah, thank you guys for sharing. So the reality is that it can happen to anybody. So it doesn't matter their race, their age, their gender, their immigration status. Anybody is at risk of being put in a potentially exploitive situation and being exposed to human trafficking. But there are definitely risk factors and vulnerabilities that can contribute to somebody's increased risk factor of being exposed to that. So kind of before I get into this, I do want to give a disclaimer that when we're looking at risk factors and vulnerabilities, I don't want this to be served as a checklist. We're not going to be having a conversation or see somebody and say, well, they meet like 5 of these check marks, so automatically they're a survivor of human trafficking. No, that's not the point. The point is to really be able to have a better understanding and context of a person's experience and how that could relate to their potential risk of being exposed to a future exploitive situation. So with that, the number one most common vulnerability that we're seeing as it relates to human trafficking is poverty. So if we're talking about somebody who is experiencing poverty, maybe they don't have as easier access to any sort of supports. Maybe they're looking for a way to make more money and to get out of their current impoverished situation. That's the number one most common vulnerability that we are seeing. Some other ones to talk about, so homelessness. So as I mentioned before, when we're talking about what industries are impacted by human trafficking, specifically as it relates to sex trafficking here in Utah, we saw that streets was a really big industry that was impacted. So if a person's experiencing homelessness, they're at a higher risk of being exposed to human trafficking because we are seeing sex trafficking particularly occur on the streets. This can also look like substance use, any history of sexual abuse or assault, child abuse or neglect if we have a youth that's a runaway, somebody's age, so if they're really young or really old, if there's any involvement with the juvenile justice or foster care system, if they have any pre-exposed mental health concerns, if they're a part of the LGBTQIA+ community, if they've had experience with domestic violence, or if they're a displaced person. And so what we're seeing when we're looking at these vulnerabilities is that a lot of them refer back to the ACEs. So ACEs is adverse childhood experiences. So taking into consideration what adverse childhood experiences or what past traumas has a person experienced and how does that affect their current life and their risk of being exposed to potentially exploitive situations in the future. One thing that I do want to talk about when we're talking about displaced persons is that oftentimes when we're talking about a displaced person, a refugee or immigrant that is coming to a new country, maybe there's a language barrier. So maybe they don't have full understanding of the language that's being spoken in their home country, in this certain country. There could be a lack of knowledge of laws in this new country. Maybe they don't understand what their labor rights are, and that can put them in a potentially exploitive situation. Oftentimes they might be displaced with little support. This can also look like, particularly if we're talking about unaccompanied minors. They may be experiencing economic instability. So this could lead them to an increase of exploitation in industries with higher instances of labor trafficking. And then when we're talking about domestic violence, we do see that there is a huge intersection of domestic violence and sex trafficking, that oftentimes what we're seeing for instances of sex trafficking, that the top recruitment tactic or the person that is most oftentimes their trafficker is some sort of intimate partner. Any questions about risk factors and vulnerabilities before we move on? Okay. So getting into recruitment and grooming. So had I mentioned drawing back on that AMP model, what actions were taken by the trafficker that put this person at risk of being exposed to a potentially exploitive situation. So what I like to say for recruitment is that traffickers will use their recruitment tactic depending on the vulnerability that the person is presenting. So if we're talking about a person that's experiencing homelessness, that trafficker might recruit that individual by offering them a place to stay. If this person looks like they're seeking some sort of love, maybe they need a supportive, healthy, or looking for a healthy relationship, that trafficker could present themselves as a significant other and give them that love and support. If we're talking about a person that maybe didn't have the most positive home life growing up, maybe they're really looking for that protector or that mother or father figure, that trafficker will present themselves in that sort of manner. And that's kind of the way that we see recruitment and grooming happening. So I like to say a recruitment tactic is dependent on the vulnerability that the individual is presenting to that trafficker. So moving forward, some top recruitment tactics. So recruitment tactics can look a little bit different when we're talking about sex trafficking and labor trafficking. One that we see that is a top recruitment tactic and has been the growing top recruitment tactic is familial trafficking. So when we're talking about familial trafficking, this is where the trafficking is occurring in the home and that the trafficker is some sort of family member. Oftentimes minors are the ones that are victims of familial trafficking. But taking kind of a look more as it relates to sex trafficking, had I mentioned before, one of the top recruitment tactics that we have seen for sex trafficking, and I've seen a lot in the work that I've done as a case manager, is that their trafficker presented themselves as some sort of significant other. But this can also look like posing as a benefactor, offering some sort of job, or feeding some sort of false promise or act of fraud. Talking about labor trafficking. So we have job offer, false promises, or fraud. Sometimes the recruitment tactic can be smuggling related or posing as a benefactor. What we see is that they're aspects of kind of all of these recruitment tactics combined into one. So maybe a person's labor trafficking showed up as a job offer. So maybe there's a recruiter in their home country that's saying, I have this great job. You're going to be working this job. You're going to be getting this much money. Your housing will be paid for. You won't have to worry about food. All of it's going to be covered. It's going to be great. So we see that job offer, that false promise. And then maybe they'll say too, I can help you get your family here across the border to be able to get this working opportunity. And so maybe they help and pay some sort of coyote fee to be able to help them get across the country. And then turns out that that situation wasn't exactly what they thought it was going to be. So we oftentimes for labor trafficking see these recruitment tactics interchange and kind of exist together. Talking about where recruitment is happening. So again, when we're talking about where recruitment is happening, recruitment will happen in places where we're going to find groups of vulnerable populations together. So again, if we're talking about a person that's experiencing homelessness, where is that trafficker going to recruit that individual? Places where they're going to see a lot of homeless folks. So this could look like homeless shelters. This can look like in libraries or parks or streets. If we're talking about an individual that wants to recruit somebody for some sort of cheap labor, they're going to recruit at a home country that maybe there's this experience of poverty and people looking for better opportunities. This can also look like if we're talking about recruiting for young children, this can look like recruiting at group homes or schools or the mall. And one that we're kind of seeing as a higher increase is recruitment happening on the internet and social media. So there's a lot of fraudulent or misleading employment advertisements that can be going out. The use of video game chat features has also been a way where recruitment can happen. So a person can use voice masking, change their voice, maybe present themselves as somebody different to be able to recruit young people. And we also see the use of apps. So if we're talking about dating apps, or we're talking about apps where you can create a profile and present yourself however you want it to be, and with the opportunity to have direct messaging and private messaging, that's a lot of times where we're seeing recruitment happen as it relates to the internet. Any questions so far? Cool, so we'll keep going. So talking about some possible indicators of trafficking. Again, this is not meant to be served as a checklist. This really just gives us some ideas of some red flags to kind of keep an eye out for. So this can look like recruiting with false promises, any signs of untreated illness or injuries, any juveniles that may exchange sex acts to meet their basic needs. This can look like controlled or restricted communication, individuals that might not have possession of their legal or travel documents, if a person's working excessive hours for little or no pay, if they have an older significant other, maybe if they're unable to speak separately or alone, or if they allegedly owe money to employers. So these are just a list of a few indicators. And obviously, if there's a big takeaway from this is that if we're having a conversation with somebody that we think there are some red flags that are being presented, the best thing to do is to just try to get as much context as possible and support them in the best way. So going into power and control. So with trafficking situations, what we're seeing most oftentimes is that there is a very nuanced, complex relationship that's held between the trafficker and the victim. And oftentimes traffickers will employ power and control to keep this individual in their trafficking situation. I'm going to list a few examples. There is this wheel that has goes into a little bit more detail about what that looks like. But ones that we do see most are birding, beating, withholding food. This can look like sexual assault, isolation, whether that be physical or emotional, any sort of psychological abuse, threats that can include their family or themselves, holding on, destroying immigration papers, threatening deportation. This is a huge one that we see, specifically as it relates to labor trafficking. So had I mentioned before that a lot of times labor trafficking situations are tied to a person's immigration status, and so that trafficker can use that lack of knowledge that somebody may have or may not possess as it relates to their immigration and say, well, if you leave this situation, I'm going to deport you, or I'm going to call the police and get you deported, or it could even threaten to destroy their papers. So we do see that a lot. Debt bondage, this can be seen in both sex and labor trafficking. Most oftentimes the example that I like to use is for labor trafficking. So maybe this person had help from their trafficker to get them to their home country, or get them to, let's say, the US, for example, and then they say, okay, you owe me $15,000 in coyote fees, and this is how you're going to pay it off, and I'm going to choose when you're done paying it off. Using that sense of debt bondage to keep a person in a situation or in the trafficking situation can make it really hard. And then that drug or alcohol dependency. So as I mentioned before, one of the risk factors and vulnerabilities having been substance abuse. So whether that trafficker recognized that a person had a substance use dependence and use that as a way to get them to, providing them with that food or that drug to be able to feel that addiction, or, created this sense of connection and got that person addicted to that drug or alcohol to keep them in that situation. So that's kind of another way that traffickers will employ power and control to keep their victims in their trafficking situation. So why don't they leave? Why do they go back? There can be many reasons why an individual may not feel comfortable leaving their trafficking situation or may not be ready, or why they might return. So this can look like a person experiencing some sort of trauma bond, so some sort of connection to their trafficker. This can look like a substance use disorder, had I mentioned before. If their trafficker is the one that's providing them that substance, it can be really hard for them to leave. If they have any sort of romantic involvement with their trafficker, if they have any fear of loneliness, economic dependency, a sense of loyalty, social support, so a sense of belonging or brotherhood. A lot of times, if we're talking about maybe a prostitution ring, or in some cases with labor trafficking, we do see that victims kind of come in big groups. And so having this fear of, if I leave my trafficking situation, what's going to happen to everybody else? A distorted sense of freedom. So traffickers will oftentimes, give victims this sense of relief or sense of freedom, saying, well, I'll let you take the car for a couple of hours, or you can do this, or you can create your own dates, to really kind of fuel and create this distorted sense of freedom. And then also the belief that there is no way out. It can be really hard for somebody to think that they can leave their trafficking situation. Maybe this is due to maybe a feeling of lack of support, or just not knowing exactly what to do to get out of that trafficking situation. So I'm going to kind of briefly touch over some of this stuff. So talking about symptoms of complex trauma. So having this understanding that the impact of trauma can be, or the impact of trauma on a victim can oftentimes be substantial. It can affect a victim's ability to tell their story. It can make it difficult for them to regulate extreme responses and impulses, such as anger and self-destructiveness. They could have experiences of dissociative episodes or disconnection from their self. They can possess a chronic sense of guilt or responsibility, where people think that, I did this to myself, this was my fault, I should have known better. It can be really difficult for people to feel any sort of trust, intimacy, or vulnerability. We can also see that symptoms of complex trauma can include substance use disorders or any other sort of mental health or medical concerns. Going a little bit further into the trauma bond, just in case anybody's not familiar with that. So a trauma bond is a victim's psychological response to extreme stress and isolation. and it is oftentimes not a reflection of their strength or character. This can happen due to several factors such as manipulation and psychological control, and the sense of a trauma bond is really a person's way to decrease their sense of pain by increasing their sense of safety. So really kind of trying to find ways to cope with the amount of stress and pain that they're enduring by making themselves believe that they're in a safe space. So this can involve complex emotional attachments. They could feel loyalty and trust towards their trafficker, but also fear. So traffickers, again, will use coercion, threats, and violence to control their victims, making them feel helpless and dependent on their trafficker. Oftentimes, what we're seeing is that victims will often show negative feelings or actions towards those that want to help them, and may even be unwilling or unable to engage in behaviors that could provide them freedom or release. So before we kind of get into the next part, do we have any questions about anything that I've talked about so far? All right, so from this training, you may think, wow, this stuff is really heavy. How can I help? What can I do to be able to support survivors of human trafficking and support agencies that are doing this great work? So ways that you can help, you can report suspected instances of human trafficking. So had I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, oftentimes victims will rarely self-identify as victims or disclose their abuse. So if there's any indicators of trafficking, again, not using it as a checklist or an assessment tool, but if they are observed, you can report them to the Utah Attorney General's Secure Strikes human trafficking tip line. We actually do, the Utah Attorney General's office does have a tip line to report any instances of human trafficking, and so you can always call that number. But if there is any case of an emergency that is requiring immediate assistance, please call 911. On here, I've also have listed the National Human Trafficking Hotline, so that's the national line. Again, the Utah Attorney General's Human Trafficking tip line, and then Internet Crimes Against Children is also a tip line that you can call and report any instances of human trafficking if you see that online. So there are other ways to get involved. So besides reporting human trafficking, there can also things that you can take on a personal level to be able to help support the fight against human trafficking. So one of those ways is being a conscientious and informed consumer. So you can find out, who's picked my tomatoes or who made my clothes using this resource that I have listed on here. You can encourage companies to take steps towards preventing human trafficking in their supply chains and encourage them to publish information about how they're making their certain clothes or, their resources. So making sure that we're being an informed consumer and thinking, who am I buying this product from, and are they doing this in an ethical way? You can also use your social media platforms to raise awareness about human trafficking. You can use the following hashtags such as #EndTraffingUtah or #BeTheOneUtah. You can also follow local, state, or national social media accounts. I encourage you to follow our AAU main social media accounts or our human trafficking support social media accounts. You can also contact your elected representatives to advocate for policies that can address the root causes of trafficking, such as poverty and inequality, and provide better protection and support for trafficking victims. We actually just had a few bills that were introduced in the 2024 legislative session that are taking actions towards providing more support towards human trafficking survivors. So contacting your elected representatives would be great. You can also volunteer and support anti-trafficking efforts in your community. So if you live in the state of Utah, you can always volunteer with our human trafficking support program here at AAU. If you go onto our main website, we actually do have a volunteer interest form that you can fill out. And then Stanley, who's our volunteer and donation specialist, will be reaching out to you and talk to you about what volunteering with our agency looks like. I also have another list that links to our website that talks about more opportunities that you can use and ways that you can get involved on a micro and a macro level. Do we have any questions?
Do you have any connections for like my area if I chose that, if I wanted to kind of help? Do you have any?
I can look.
Okay, little homework for you.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I also have my contact information on here. So if anybody has any questions or wants more information, also if you're looking to get a copy of these slides, I am more than happy to share those with you. But I just want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to attend this training. And I just appreciate all of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Good job.
All right. Bye, everybody.